Today on Voices for Change, a sharp rise in anti-Asian hate and violence, leaving communities in fear.
We know what the problems are. We know how to approach them, but we don't do anything about it until something, tragic happens like this.
Enough is enough. Asian Americans and their allies stand in solidarity.
The Asian American community really standing up, flocking together, and coming together with a powerful voice.
Plus, the pandemic driving women out of the workforce at an alarming rate, the national emergency.
It is absolutely a crisis that we have to handle immediately.
Xiao Zhe Tan, Dao Yo Fung, Hyun Jung Grant, Sun Ja Kim, Sun Jung Park, Yong A Yu, Paul Andre Michaels, Delana Ashley Yon. Those are the names of the 8 people shot and killed at 3 Georgia spas on March 16th. 6 of the victims, women of Asian descent. They were mothers, daughters, business owners, beloved friends. Memorials continue to grow at the spas as their families mourn. The shootings sparked outrage and fear in the Asian American community. Here in the Bay Area, Xiao Zhen, a 76-year-old woman attacked on San Francisco's Market Street, is still recovering from physical and emotional wounds. Her GoFundMe nearing $1 million, money she plans to donate back to the Asian American community. After he was brutally assaulted in the financial district, Danny Yu Chang said, "Nothing is safe here." While law enforcement have not classified these incidents as hate crimes, the victims believe they were attacked for no other reason than how they look. And these are just a few of the examples in a sharp rise in anti-Asian bias and violence. In response to these horrific attacks, the Asian Pacific Islander community and its allies have stood together, holding rallies, denouncing hate to protect the most vulnerable. Volunteers have started citizen patrols. Bay Area police departments have also stepped up their patrols to ease anxiety. State and federal lawmakers have introduced bills to increase support for hate crime victims, even holding a congressional hearing.
What happens right now and over the course of the coming months will send a message for generations to come as to whether we matter, whether the country we call home chooses to erase us or include us, dismiss us or respect us, invisibilize us or see us.
Nonprofit Stop AAPI Hate tracks incidents of discrimination or violence against Asian Americans. According to their latest report, there were 3,795 anti-Asian incidents in the last year. 68% were verbal harassment, 20% shunning or deliberate avoidance, and 11% were physical assaults. We are joined now by the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate and San Francisco State professor, Dr. Russell Jung. Dr. Jung, thanks for talking with us. I wanted to give you first a chance to reflect on the Georgia shootings and the response that we've seen from communities since then.
Thanks, Greg. Both personally, I think I'm with the Asian American community and grieving with the families of the victims. We're outraged, we're distressed, and clearly I think there's a climate of fear and anxiety besieging us. I think across the nation, we're telling our elders stay inside. We're the racial group least likely to send our students back to school because we're afraid not only of the pandemic, but because of racial bullying and racism.
Your new report shows nearly 3,800 anti-Asian incidents in just the last year. What do those numbers tell you? Because I understand they're probably just a fraction of what has occurred. And how important is it now to have this tool to track discrimination? It's
true. The data we're receiving, their self-reported incidents, are just a fraction of what's happening across the nation. We've received reports from all 50 states. It's widespread and it's pervasive. The story it tells is horrific. And actually, sadly, because I've read daily the vitriol and hatred that other Americans are directing towards Asian Americans, I wasn't surprised about the Atlanta shootings. I've seen time and time again how people are blaming Asians for the coronavirus, how they're saying we don't belong here, we need to go back home, and that exclusion of Asian Americans, that objectification of Asian Americans, and now the pushing and shoving of our elderly, it wasn't surprising. Our data demonstrates this happening on a regular basis.
Dr. Jung, I've heard you speak about, and many of us know, that anti-Asian sentiment did not start with COVID-19, but certainly seems to have been exacerbated by it and the rhetoric around it. What do you want people to understand about a long, at times complicated history of xenophobia, misogyny, and discrimination in our country?
I want people to understand that the West has long had a fear of Asians. There's this yellow peril stereotype that Asians will come from the West and overcome the West, the U.S., with their hordes, with their diseases. And that fear has been invoked again and again. The fear then leads to the anger directed towards Asian Americans. In the 19th century, U.S. passed the Chinese Exclusion Act because they were afraid that we brought the diseases of malaria, cholera, and leprosy. They also thought we were taking white workers' jobs. So my own family's fishing village in Monterey, we had 200 people living there at the turn of the century. That entire village was burned out and displaced. And so my great-grandparents had to retreat to San Francisco Chinatown. This displacement occurred 300 times in the 19th century. So this yellow peril fear, this violence, this the official policies that treat us as outsiders has been long part of our history.
We have seen many communities stand in solidarity, rallies supporting us. What can you say about that?
This is a really dark time, and I'm angry about the hatred directed to us. I'm saddened by an American society that produces individuals that feel free to cough on their fellow human. But I've been heartened by the response that the Asian American community itself has poured out, and the response of our allies. I always tell people now, in times of danger and Asians feel like they're threatened, people can go into fight mode, flight mode, or flock mode. Fight mode means we are arming ourselves, and I know some parents are telling their kids to carry mace now. We go into flight mode. We're telling our grandparents, stay indoors. But flock mode is when we gather together and protect each other. We come together to grieve and support one another. We come together for protection and for power, and we come together for collective voice. And I see that flocking momentum I've seen it the entire COVID-19, the Asian American community really standing up, flocking together, and coming together with a powerful voice. And that's why we're getting the national attention we need right now. And I've seen other groups flock to us, our allies, other communities of color, white allies. People recognize that this isn't just an Asian American problem, it's an American problem. It's an American problem of racism, it's an American problem of violence, it's America's problem towards us. And so other Americans need to address this issue, not necessarily Asian Americans.
Actor, producer, director, and Bay Area native Daniel Wu has been speaking out about this issue since June of last year. In a poignant op-ed, he wrote, "Only with solidarity can we form lakes and oceans to extinguish the flames of racism."
You spoke up very early on and bring attention to this issue. I wanted to get your sense now and your thoughts about what has transpired in the last several weeks, what we've seen, particularly in the Georgia area.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that events turn that way, but it's one of those things where, like, we warned you, this was coming, and I've gotten attention for this recently, but I've been trying to get attention for it for a long time, since probably I would say April last year, a year ago, and nobody was listening. I wrote an article for The Undefeated talking about this. I put up another reward earlier for the grandmother that was burned and lit on fire in New York City. And none of that got any traction. And then it wasn't until the Oakland situation, right after Visha Tanapakdi's death, that we finally got attention to it. And it's been amazing that we have gotten this attention, and there's this national unity now. And I think one of the hardest things about the Asian American community is that we're not a monolith. There's so many different cultures and languages within the community itself. And that's probably why we haven't in the past really gotten together and unified. But what we're seeing now is a really strong, unified Asian American community, unlike you've ever seen before. So that gives me glimmers of hope.
We're also seeing other minority groups standing together in solidarity. How important is that?
That's a key point here. Black Lives Matter also matter to us as well, because I think all people of color have been oppressed in this country. and people in poverty, and not just people of color. There's white people who are also in very dire situations, and that we all need to stand together in order to fight this kind of oppression. And if you're talking about white supremacy and racist systemic racism, it's designed to set us against each other. And so I'm disheartened often to see these comments, the Asians don't stand up for blacks, or blacks don't stand up for Asians, when in history we know that's not true. Yuri Kochiyama was with Malcolm X when he was murdered. She was holding his head when he was assassinated. We have a history of stepping out for each other. So let's not point fingers about who's not doing what, and let's forget about what kind of things you're harboring now, and let's get together and fight this thing. Because I feel like when COVID happened, that was a moment for us as a country to really unite and get together, but we did the exact opposite. We became really divisive politically, culturally, all that kind of stuff, and just started to become really tribal.
We talked about this issue of allyship. What does that look like to you, and what can people do in this moment to stop this hate?
We need to, as small communities, reach out to other communities and help them out, socialize with them. We are one group, and this is the Bay Area here. Where I grew up, what started this for me was seeing all these abhorrent crimes happening in the place where I grew up, which was not the place I left when I went to Hong Kong. Even in the 70s, 80s, which you could say was not as good of a time, we got along in the Bay Area, I thought. And yes, there were these little petty crimes here and there, but generally we got along. And now when I'm seeing this massive division in the Bay Area, it's so disheartening and so sad, because I know this place can do better. And I'm really hoping and pushing for the Bay Area to become better. And California is always a catalyst for change across the country. And I think that we can show the rest of the country how we can do this, how we can unite, and how to work with each other.
It's going to have a cascading effect in terms of children, in terms of family balance, in terms of society functioning well.
Millions have lost their jobs during the pandemic, but the impact being felt disproportionately by women. After the break, an expert weighs in.
This is a national emergency. Women leaving the workforce in these numbers, it's a national emergency.
The economic fallout of the pandemic left millions out of work, but for women, it has hit especially hard, and experts say it could take years to make up these losses. Consultant Tracy Webb explains why this should be something we all work to fix.
Roughly 2.5 million women have left the workforce in the last year. That's significantly higher than the number of men. VP Harris called this a national emergency. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree. This is something that has to be addressed immediately, because women since 2010 were really making gains in terms of their place in the workforce. But after this pandemic, all of those gains have been reversed, and it's just absolutely debilitating.
Tracy, within that 2.5 million women, we know that women of color are disproportionately represented, because oftentimes those are the women who are working in essential jobs. Can you speak to that issue a little bit?
Sure. So oftentimes these positions, such as retail or an industry, I've done a lot of work in home health care. A lot of these workers are women of color. And unfortunately, these were the jobs that were hit by the pandemic because they required in-person skill. And once that happened, these women had no employment, and it is absolutely a crisis that we have to handle immediately.
Many have pointed to the crisis of childcare and how difficult it may be to find it, especially during a pandemic. How much of a role has that played in women leaving the workforce?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. Well, first of all, we would like to say that we moved to a more egalitarian society, but a lot of things have shown that that's not the case. And I don't have numbers in front of me, but I think all of us know anecdotally that even in a two-sex household, the women, the female or the female identifying, tends to have bear more of the responsibilities for child rearing and for household management. So there is this notion of, if somebody's job, if you have two people and someone has to stay home, it's going to typically be the person that has the most experience or the most predilection, whatever that is. And I'm not making gender stereotypes. It's just the way things are. So women are hit disproportionately hard with this.
Though it is women that have been most affected, why it is so significant for men and women and everyone, frankly, to make sure that they are part of the solution to get women back into the workforce.
Because, if there's one lesson that we all should have learned through this pandemic, it's that we're all in this together. There's this tremendous interdependency. Everything from, the anti-Asian, we need to stop this anti-Asian hate because one of us is hurt, all of us is hurt. And it's the same thing with women. If you've got what it used to be, over 50% of the workforce that is almost 100% of those who lost their jobs in December of last year, for example, that is a problem. It's going to have a cascading effect in terms of children, in terms of family balance, in terms of society functioning well. It has to be addressed. So there's a lot that people can do, and you feel better when you get out of this I can't mentality, which we're all stuck in to some extent in this horrible pandemic, right? To I can't. And there are a number of changes that women can make to take things into their own hands. And partners and friends need to be supportive and understanding.
The mental health effects of the pandemic will also be felt for quite some time. Isolation, depression, and anxiety have many of us searching for help, but it can be a challenge. Dr. Mike Stanton spoke to us about stigmas, especially for men of color.
According to the American Psychiatric Association, 1 in 3 Black adults, only 1 in 3, receives the mental health care when they need it. I know part of that is access, but how much of that has to do with stigma in your mind?
Stigma it can be based on so many different types of, parts of a person. And absolutely, I think we're seeing that some of those aspects are becoming really highlighted in our media, unfortunately. And I'm really glad we're doing this program because I think that, particularly people of color and groups that maybe have been marginalized historically, that they are most, in not most in need, but very, very, very much in need. And as you mentioned that statistic, they're not necessarily getting the kind of mental health support they need.
How do we reach communities of color when it comes to mental health care, particularly men?
Women are more likely to seek mental health care, more likely to have the types of mental health issues that are seen in a clinic, depression, anxiety. But I think what we're seeing here is that actually men experience very much the same level of distress and anxiety and depression, but they don't necessarily express it in the same way that women do. So men might be more likely to drink too much or smoke too much or maybe play a lot of video games. Another thing that comes to mind is really having examples of people in our society who are looked up to, who are experiencing mental health crises and who seek mental health treatment. And I think getting a better understanding that therapy is much more than that. It's men sitting down and talking about what's really going on in their lives, the difficulties of being a dad, the difficulties of finding a job in a tough work environment, employment environment. Fear about COVID-19, very real concerns that men have that they really would find a lot of peace and answers to their questions that they're searching in therapy.
But what would you say to people about general well-being and why it may start with the mind, and the mind may be the most important place?
I'm very passionate about the fact that when we treat our mind, we're treating our body. And when we're treating our body, we're treating our mind. And we really can't disentangle the two of those.
I hope it gives like a beacon of hope or belief or whatever it needs to do for people to just like believe in themselves.
Representation matters. Coming up, we talk with the star of the new movie, Boogie. The new movie, Boogie, tells the story of an Asian American basketball star in New York, balancing family expectations while chasing his dreams. The movie's leading man, Taylor Takahashi, grew up playing ball in the Bay Area. He spoke to us about the importance of representation on the big screen.
I think pretty cool for any of us that had hoop dreams growing up. So for you, what was it like to play Boogie? And did you tap into kind of your childhood at all for this?
100%. I think one of the toughest things was just trying to remember that you don't have your life experience. I'm 28, the kid's 18. And it's remembering, how you were when you were 18 years old. You're a little bit more naive, you're a little bit more raw, you're a little bit more quick to react to things.
No one believes in an Asian basketball player.
This film really puts Asian American culture at the forefront, right? About being kind of a first generation kid and growing up in that atmosphere. And then also some of the racism or the xenophobia that comes with it. How important is it to you to kind of see that on the big screen and to be part of that?
There's such I see myself in this type movie. And some people, it's the direct experience, some people, Asian American and, first generation immigrant family, whether you're playing basketball or not, like they just know that arc and that journey. But whether you're Asian or not, if you're an immigrant in this country, like you go through similar things. It's a little bit more directed to who you are and where you come from. But like the world is still kind of the same. You're just kind of navigating in America, trying to figure out like, where am I going to go and how am I going to do these things? And for us, the authenticity of, I think, what the movie portrays is what's so special to us. It's the first time that like I've seen if I didn't do the movie, it would be the first time that I saw myself like up on the screen. And it's just like, wow, like that person looks exactly like me, does exactly the same things, lives a very similar life or what it appears to be. And I hope it gives like a beacon of hope or belief or whatever it needs to do for people to just like believe in themselves.
How important is it to see faces like yours and mine represented on the big screen, right? That you're a leading role in a big movie that's coming out, and how important is it that we continue to see that?
It's huge. And I hope that this is kind of like the foundation for people to start telling their like regular stories, and I love the Asian representation that started Crazy Rich Asians, Parasite. I love those movies. Crazy Rich Asians for me wasn't that relatable. It's like a cool story, but it tells kind of this like fake persona that Asian people have. For me, it's just like, I hope it's the normalization of these things. And, for me and myself, it always people get super bright-eyed and they're like, whoa, like an Asian person on there. And it's like, I appreciate that. And, I love it, but like, I hope that like kind of calms down. And it's just like, okay, wow, that's just a real story about a real person doing real things. And that's what I hope moving forward kind of starts the awe moment starts to tamper down. And it's just really just like, wow, I recognize real in a way. And it's like, boom, I see that, I identify with that, I can plug into that, and I can relate to that. And that's what I think is really important.
For more Voices for Change content, you can download the all-new KTVU app. You can find online or in the App Store. You can also find more on ktvu.com/Voices for Change. It's a general rule in journalism. Don't let yourself become part of the story. A rule I've devoted the last 15 years to following, but indulge me for a second. Recently, I began to have these difficult conversations about anti-Asian hate on the air and off. I went to my parents, Korean immigrants who came to this country 40 years ago. They became citizens, had my brother and me, so we could all live the American dream. The same story as millions of Asian Americans, including some of the victims in Georgia. In the wake of these recent incidents, my parents shared stories they've never shared with me. Stories about the racism they've endured. Stories as recent as last month. Every time before I hang up the phone with them, I tell them to be careful when they leave the house. It makes me sad. It makes me angry. But here's the point, the silver lining. We are talking about these issues. We are rallying together, demanding change. So join the conversation. Hear us. Stand with us. And let this be a first step, not a fleeting moment. we leave you with some resources to keep this conversation going.